Welcome to the fourth and final session of our webinar series for 2012, and thank you for joining us today. We hope that you can hear me nice and clearly. If you've participated in one of our webinars before, welcome back. It's really nice to have you with us, and if this is your first time joining us, thank you for being here this afternoon. And what I'm going to do in a little while is just talk you through what's happening on your screen and explain how you can get involved. So I'm Sue. I'm responsible here at Warrington Voluntary Action for developing and delivering excellence in volunteer management training. And I'm here today with our technical director, Chris Huffey.
Hello.
That was Chris saying hello. We aim to deliver a webinar designed specifically to focus on volunteer management issues approximately every other month. And we'll let you know later on how you can access the playbacks and resources from all the past presentations. And today I'm delighted to welcome our guest speaker, Rob Jackson of Rob Jackson Consulting. Rob, would you just like to say a quick hello?
Hello everybody.
Thank you, Rob. And we'll also be hearing from Claire Teal of Volunteering New Zealand a little bit later on as well. So, without further ado, let's get started. That's fine. I'm just having a little bit of trouble with my presentation, folks. I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about how everything works. You should have a control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. And I'm just having a little bit of a problem with my slides at the moment, so do bear with us. But hopefully you can see the control panel on the right. And there's a space within that. There's a little box there for you to type questions or comments. We really want to hear from you today. It's really important. If you want to speak to us, we'd love it if some people came on the line and had some questions for Rob, questions for myself, some comments. Please press the little hand icon if you want to speak to us. And what happens there is that that will come through to Chris, and he'll be able to send you a message to make sure that you're all ready to come live on air. We'll try and build as many of your comments into the discussion as possible, so please do keep those coming through to us. You can also participate today if you're a tweeter. We're using this particular hashtag for International Volunteer Managers Day. There's a few of them going around. So it's just IVM Day with the hashtag. We hope some of you will be joining us that way too, so please send your comments through that way. And the reason why we're tweeting with a different hashtag today is because it is International Volunteer Managers Day. So welcome, and well done for taking some time out for you. And although you're here today with us, you might still be thinking why we need a specific day to focus on volunteer managers. Well, the theme and purpose of the day is all about education through celebration, which I think is quite a nice tagline, because it highlights the fact that volunteering needs to be supported, planned, developed and resourced. And as we all know, a huge part about that is about recognising the role of the person who is leading, managing and coordinating all those things. So I really like the way that they've sort of set up this year's theme, because it's asking who else could do that, demonstrating the range of the skills and the knowledge and the level of competency required to do the job well. And I think this is an important message for our colleagues, for our organisations and for decision makers to understand, because yes, potentially anybody could be put in charge of volunteers or coordinate volunteers, but the difference and the distinction that we need to focus on is about doing it well and doing it brilliantly. I believe that regardless of what you might think about having a dedicated day for volunteer managers, if nothing else it provides us with a platform and creates an opportunity to acknowledge within yourselves how integral your role is, to influence, as we've discussed a lot of times through our previous webinars, and to share what you do. Because a lot of the time you are there quietly getting on with it, making important stuff happen with the volunteers and facilitating and enabling their work and ultimately delivering valuable services within your communities. So the point is, I think, is that unless we shout more about it, other people within the organisation and those developing the policy about volunteering don't always realise what's involved. So I don't know if you can see there on the screen, we've got an example of one of the Facebook banners and posters, Go Crazy, Celebrate International Volunteer Managers Day. Well, you couldn't get more crazy than joining us on a webinar, quite frankly. honestly. I promise. Here's another one of the posters for this year's International Volunteer Managers Day. I just thought it's worth sort of sharing this if you hadn't seen it already, because there's some great words on here. Leader, motivator, strategist, visionary, project manager, humanitarian, community organizer, social entrepreneur, mentor, miracle worker. Now, you might identify with all of these descriptors or just some of them, but either way, if you have responsibility for volunteers, you'll need to be drawing on these skill sets at some time or another in your work. And I know myself from working with volunteer managers over the years that the term miracle worker isn't really an exaggeration. And when you consider all these aspects together, it's quite an amazing job, really. I mean, who else could do that? I'd just like to say as well about working with volunteers, you know, potentially it's an attractive prospect, it's challenging, incredibly rewarding, and increasingly complex in terms of balancing the needs of the organisation, the client group and the funder, along with the needs of a group of people who basically don't have to turn up if they don't want to. How amazing is that? The volunteer manager is the person who's motivating the people who donate their time. And seeing as time is our most precious commodity, we could ask, why aren't we doing more to support and develop the people who support and motivate those who give their time freely? So, I guess having a dedicated day for volunteer managers potentially helps us share these important messages and provides you with an opportunity to prioritise you, as you are doing today. So that's probably enough from me, at least for the time being. We're going to hear from Rob in a moment, but I thought it would be useful to have a poll here. And those of you that haven't taken part in this before, there's some questions popping up on the screen now. And we've got a question. The question is, what do you think about having a dedicated day for volunteer managers? So your options are, it's a brilliant idea and a great chance to celebrate volunteer managers. If it helps to highlight issues, it's a good thing. Perhaps it's the first that you've really heard about it. And maybe some of you are still feeling a little bit unsure about, well, why do we need a special day, and is it a little bit, you know, a little bit twee, a little bit strange? Where are the other professions celebrating their day? Although, as someone pointed out to me earlier on today, you know, we have special weeks for celebrating sandwiches and all manner of things. So why not a day for celebrating volunteer managers? Okay, so just going to give you a moment to continue to respond. Responses are coming in there, and nearly all of you have voted. There's a couple of you that haven't quite. Most people are basically saying if it helps to highlight the issues, then it's a good thing. Oh, over half of you. Yeah. Should we show that? So the results coming up on the screen for you there. So generally, quite positive feeling about it. So 52% of you think it's almost like if we didn't need it, you know, then we wouldn't need it. So, you know, the fact is, it's another reason to shout about what you do, which I think can only be a good thing. Okay, thank you for taking part in that. We've got another couple of polls coming up later on. And as I said before, there's opportunity for you to comment throughout and also hopefully to come on the line in a little while. We'd like that very much. That's definitely enough from me. I'd really like to introduce you now to our guest speaker, Rob Jackson, who many of you know, I'm sure.
Hello, everyone.
Hello, Rob. You have to excuse me. I'm having a problem with my screen again, and my slides aren't working very well. I'm just being all upfront about it to everybody. But I'm going to introduce Rob while we see if we can sort that out. I'm sure lots of you know Rob. Thank you, Huffy. I'm sure lots of you know Rob. He's based in the UK and is an international speaker and trainer on volunteerism. Thanks for taking time to join us today.
Absolute pleasure.
Now, Rob, I know you've been involved with International Volunteer Managers Day over the years, and you're currently part of the organising committee. Can you explain a little bit about how all that works? You know, sort of how's it all come about, really?
Yeah, well, back in the late 1990s, a lady called Nan Hawthorne, who's based over in Seattle neck of the woods, came up with the idea of doing a day to celebrate the contribution that volunteer managers make. And that's really where the whole kind of concept of International Volunteer Managers Day started. But it really took off when Andy Fryer, who a number of you may know about, Andy manages a hospital volunteer program near Adelaide in South Australia, and has spoken at a number of conferences and events internationally in the UK. And Andy volunteered to take over International Volunteer Managers Day when Nan kind of stood down from that role, really, and he's been instrumental in pulling together a steering committee, which includes myself and Claire Teal, who we're going to hear from soon, and an international supporters group, which is organisations and individuals from all around the world. The latest member of which is the Points of Light Hands-On, which is the roughly equivalent body to Volunteering England in the US, and has really kind of driven a lot of the developments that we've seen up until the point where this year, from what I've seen in the few hours since I kind of logged on at about 6:30, 7 o'clock this morning, I think we've probably had the most successful International Volunteer Managers Day ever.
Yeah, we're really noticing there's a lot of activity on Twitter and on Facebook and on LinkedIn, which is really, really exciting. Why do you think International Volunteer Managers Day is important, Rob? What would you say, really, to people who aren't necessarily bought into the idea of it, for example?
Yeah, well, and I think the first thing I'd say is it's really encouraging seeing the results of that poll, because one of the things that Andy and myself, as the two of the people who've been involved in it for longest, have experienced a lot is resistance to the idea of having a day to celebrate volunteer managers. And I think because a lot of volunteer managers would prefer the emphasis was put on the volunteers rather than themselves, and that's completely understandable. But I think the slogan you mentioned earlier, Sue, about celebrating through educating, is actually the key thing. The day is not all about volunteer managers giving ourselves a pat on the back and saying, aren't we wonderful, we're so much better than anybody else in the sector. It's about saying this is a really important role, whether you work as a paid volunteer manager, whether you volunteer as a volunteer manager. The role of leading and engaging other people in volunteering is absolutely fundamental to what makes civil society, voluntary sector, whatever language you want to use, work, and we need to acknowledge that, we need to recognise that, we need to celebrate it, and we need to support and invest in it. And if it's one day of the year when we have an opportunity to really push that message out quite strongly, then I think it's something that we should be seizing with both hands. So it's great to see so many people on this webinar agreeing with that sentiment and starting to use it to build some momentum where it becomes a kind of point in the calendar that people are going to rally around and move volunteer management forward from.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right, because it's a real opportunity, isn't it, to get creative and to, you know, it's not just about sort of saying, oh, look, there's a day, you know, and aren't we all wonderful, and patting ourselves on the back. You know, it's really a chance to sort of influence, to maybe put on an event, to, you know, someone was saying earlier on Twitter that they're tweeting via their intranet, so they're part of a bigger organisation, so they're able to do the whole kind of education celebration thing, you know, and it doesn't have to be big grand gestures either. It could just be a conversation that you have with someone. But for me, it's sort of like anything that kick-starts or provides that forum. And I think if you feel like you're doing it with other people, you feel a bit more encouraged and reassured by that.
Yeah, I mean, what other day in the sector do you see a volunteer manager in Dorset dressing up as a badger to celebrate volunteer managers? Thank you to Steve Davis down at Dorset Wildlife Trust for doing that.
He spudders on Twitter, and I've missed that. I can't believe I've missed that. What have I been doing all morning?
What a great image! But I think the fantastic thing about it, and the thing I'd stress is, you know, the people who are organising International Volunteer Managers Day we are ourselves volunteers.
Absolutely.
You know, none of us get paid to do it. We put a lot of our own time and effort in, same as volunteers up and down the length of the country, indeed all around the world do. And it's a collaborative endeavour as a result. I mean, if you go onto the International Volunteer Managers Day web pages and see the resources, it's the product of the creativity of a whole bunch of people, whether it's the guys at Volunteering Queensland who produced all these wonderful trailer teaser videos on YouTube, or people who've designed the posters, or the resource pack that Volunteering New Zealand built together for their members this year. You know, and anybody can get involved in it. We are, I'll do my recruitment pitch on behalf of Andy now, we are always looking for new people to get involved in the organising committee, because work starts kind of 6 to 9 months out from the day. So, you know, if people are interested, then they should get in touch, and we'll find a role for them.
Well, I think, you know, that you make a great point there, and I think that kind of leads us in nicely to, you know, what you and I was sort of wanted to talk about, you know, because obviously we're using the International Volunteer Managers Day as a sort of a platform to talk about the benefits of being part of the international community. And there's a great example already of, you know, an opportunity for somebody or a few people who are interested in broadening their horizons, maybe networking globally, and you know, sharing their own skills, knowledge and expertise in a different platform. So, you know, we were going to talk, weren't we, about what it is about the volunteer management profession in particular that lends itself to the whole idea of international exchange and networking. I'm just interested to, you know, get some of your initial thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, I think part of it is because the role of volunteer manager has been an isolating one for so long. I mean, I think back, we talk about this a lot, but I mean, I think back to when I started in the sector back in about 1994, 1995, pre-email, you know, decent internet access, certainly pre all the tools that we have to engage now, and you were the only person in that organisation who was doing that role quite often. Yeah. And so as soon as the opportunities for international exchange were opened up by the technology, I think our field grabbed it with both hands, because it was fantastic. I don't have to be on my own anymore. And Susan Ellis says there's really no excuse for anybody to feel isolated in volunteer management anymore, because actually there's such a plethora of ways for people to engage and network with each other. I think
I'd be inclined to agree with that, actually, and I do say that quite frequently to volunteer managers, so sorry for jumping in there.
No. I mean, I accept actually knowing where to go and knowing the right networks. You know, it's like anything to do with online. There's tons of information up there, and, you know, you need to find the right stuff that works for you, but there's lots of communities there. But I think the other thing is that despite the fact that you will sometimes hear, well, you know, volunteer management's not the same in my organisation because I'm a museum as opposed to a hospital, as opposed to a sports club or what have you, there is actually far more in common around volunteer management. And I can speak from my own experience of being fortunate enough to travel and work with volunteer managers in countries all over the world. And we all have far more in common than we have that separates us. And I think a combination of that, alongside the fact that many of us have kind of felt that and experienced that isolation, that, you know, maybe fundraising colleagues don't do, or, you know, accountancy colleagues don't have, etc. You put those kind of two things together, and I think it really opens up the desire to network with other people in the field, and if the opportunity presents, to do that internationally as well.
Yeah, no, you make some really great points. I think what's interesting is what you say about the similarities, differences thing, because I know as a trainer, when I work with volunteer managers, often one of the first things people will say when they introduce themselves on training is, what we do is a little bit different. And I wished I'd had £1 for every time I'd heard somebody say that to me, because then when we start to tell the stories and we start to share and we start to, you know, kind of unwrap it all, what we realise is we've got a lot more in common than we realise. And I think you're right, I think that transcends, you know, kind of beyond, you know, sort of continents and things.
And I think
sorry,
the most valuable learning experiences I've had have been where you move beyond the limitations of the literature and the knowledge that's purely around volunteer management. I mean, there is lots of literature around about volunteer management. You just have to Google volunteer management to see that. But a lot of it comes at things from the same angle. The most powerful learning experiences have been taking something from a completely different angle and reflecting back into volunteer management, and particularly if it's volunteering in a completely different societal or cultural context.
Yeah, and well, I've put your quote up that I'd sort of pulled from a blog post that you wrote about this recently, because you wrote about this as part of one of our Thoughtful Thursday tweet chats, and I really liked what you said. You know, seeing the issues we face reflected in the mirror of a different setting and culture can be an incredibly valuable learning experience. So, yeah, you know, I mean, you started to talk about there in the sort of drawing on not just from what's happening in other places, but what's almost happening in other settings and other fields.
Absolutely.
Is that what you mean by that?
Absolutely. I mean, a couple of examples. One, from the international perspective, certainly in terms of travel, is having been fortunate enough to do some training and what have you in the States and in Australia. It's interesting to reflect on the volunteering context between those two countries and ours, because I think quite often people kind of dismiss research or dismiss writing that's from another country because, well, that's America, they do things differently. And my observation, which I've had colleagues validate for me from those countries, is that here the roots of volunteering, particularly in the last kind of 100, 200 years, have been very much in the well-off doing to the less well-off, that kind of philanthropic. And I mean, you can just see the way that successive governments talk about policy around volunteering, that they see it in that way. You know, the fact they talk about underrepresented groups, as if people with disabilities and people who are on lower socioeconomic gradings don't volunteer at all, and therefore they need the well-off to do good things to them. You go to the States and it's far more that kind of self-help frontier spirit. You all have to kind of get involved because, you know, your life's on the line. You can see that in the response to Hurricane Sandy last week, and the way that people were just saying, look, we're fortunate, we haven't been hit, but we're going out there and we're going to do something about helping those people that have. And then you go somewhere like Australia and it has a really fascinating mix of the two because of the colonial history, but also the way that country was colonised by people from Europe, people from Britain, and needed that kind of frontier spirit. So when you look at the way that they do volunteering in those two different countries, then you compare it back to us, you can see different ways in which they approach things. You can see different perspectives they have on the same issues that potentially give you insights into resolving some of the challenges that you might be facing back at home.
Yeah.
And the other example I give in terms of context is between that kind of formal and informal volunteering, and
yes.
we focus a lot on formal volunteering, and anybody who's ever heard me speak about any of this kind of stuff before will know that one of my big bugbears is formal volunteering has become all about processes and all about systems and all about HR kind of stuff. Informal volunteering is still all about people, and the processes and the systems are less important. Look at riot cleanup, for example, last year. And we can learn a lot from the formal side of things, from the way that those informal networks work, and vice versa. But we've got to look outside of our comfort zone and outside of the bubble in which we operate day to day to really get that potential.
Yeah, I mean, I think you make an excellent case, actually, for the benefits of international exchange, and I think it is about really kind of broadening our viewpoint. As you say, even just a lot of people, we do get very bogged down within the bubble of our own organisation, or even within our own department or region or area. So at the face of it, actually sort of looking at what's happening over the other side of the world might just seem incredibly alien to us. But because of the way the world is now, you know, because of the way we are connected, it's easy to do. Therefore, we just need to sort of understand how to, I don't know, interpret, see the potential, you know, look for the opportunities to learn. You know, and as a sort of training and learning practitioner myself, this is the stuff that I get very excited about, because, you know, that idea that we come saying, oh, what we do is really different. Well, let's understand and unpack the sort of distinctions and the similarities.
Absolutely.
That's excellent. You also posted up some really interesting questions, I think, as part of the Thoughtful Thursday tweet chat that you did for us a couple of weeks ago. And I was just, what I thought, dear listeners, is that I thought it would be nice to kind of give Rob his questions back and see how he would answer them. So I'm putting him on the spot a little bit here, but you asked these questions as part of the blog that you wrote for us on IVO. And the first one was that you asked volunteer managers how you would like them to how they would like to benefit from international exchange.
Mm-hmm.
So what's your answer to that? How would you like them to benefit?
I would like every single volunteer manager listening to this to have the opportunity to travel to the other side of the world and experience hands-on some volunteer management in another organisation in a completely different context. Back in the real world, however.
I thought you were going to propose sort of like virtual secondments or something. That would be quite cool.
I mean, I think the thing is, the opportunities are there. We tend to think, when we think about international, we tend to think, oh, well, that means in volunteer management terms, certainly it means going to places like Australia and New Zealand and America and Canada and Singapore, you know, the places that have really good setups. I think what we forget is actually we've got loads of great stuff going on really close to home. You know, you just, I know this is completely anti-British to say, but you just hop over the English Channel, and there is a massive wealth of stuff going on around volunteering in Europe. And it's not expensive to get over there. It's not expensive to get to some of these conferences. Maybe it means sometimes we have to use some of our own money to be able to subsidise going to that rather than relying on organisation budgets to do it. But when it's perhaps the cost of a cheap return flight on a budget airline to Berlin or wherever it may be in order to attend a conference and learn. I mean, I did some work last year for the European Year of volunteering on quality volunteering, co-chaired a working group, and we had perspectives from almost every single country of the EU there, and that's probably why it took us 9 months to decide what we actually meant about quality volunteering. But the insights that we all got from reflecting on one common issue in a variety of different settings were incredibly powerful. So I'd love for volunteer managers to be able to have that kind of experience, and if we're in the UK, it's dead easy to do it just by hopping over to Europe and getting involved in something like a CEV General Assembly or a Volunteer Europe conference or something like that.
And I think that's an excellent point, and I think I'm guilty of that myself, because I think my initial connections are much further afield, you know, looking at Australia and looking at America and Canada in particular, and I'm not as well versed in terms of what's going on in Europe, despite the fact that, you know, we were part of a European Year of Volunteering project last year. So, you know, I think there's a lot to explore there, and that's potentially quite exciting.
Yeah.
So what is it, kind of looking at it the other way, what is it that you think that the UK has to offer, you know, to sort of, as we're talking about this as the idea of an exchange, what do you think the UK has to offer to other countries in terms of what they can learn from us?
I mean, whether we like it or not, the political agenda, having been so involved in volunteering for, coming up on 15 years at least now, is probably, you know, more engaged than it has been in a lot of other countries, certainly that I've come across, in both a good way and a bad way, in terms of the way that, you know, successive governments have attempted to reshape volunteering, etc., etc. And I think the sector here has adapted to that quite well. We cope with that quite well in terms of the change that presents to us. So I think there's lessons that we could be sharing from our own experience. You know, whether that's direct experience in big initiatives like V or the Experience Corps or Millennium Volunteers or National Citizen Service or whatever else it may be. I think there's a lot that's happened, both good and then sadly more recently bad, in terms of the way that volunteering infrastructure has developed in this country. And I know when I was at Volunteering England probably 3-4 years ago, colleagues internationally were really looking at what was going on around volunteering infrastructure in this country as being, or in England certainly, as being leading the way in the world. And I think the change in government and the reduction in funding for that has sadly meant that we're not in that position anymore. But both from what we did in the good years and how we're having to adapt to the current times, I think there's a lot of lessons that we can share there as well. Yeah. And I think the other thing I'd add is the way that we've adapted as a country that's seen a massive amount of immigration, the way that we've adapted volunteering in order to fit with a much more multicultural society and with an influx of people for whom they maybe either don't have a cultural concept or words in their language around volunteering, or the understanding of volunteering is very, very different from what kind of quote-unquote mainstream volunteering is, and how we've had to adapt and develop to that as well. And again, that's not necessarily something other countries have experienced quite so much.
I think that, so there's a lot here for us to learn, and it's a reciprocal thing.
Absolutely.
I think that's part of learning. What about individual volunteer managers then? You've talked very kind of broadly there about, sort of how we sort of generally do things in our infrastructure and how we've sort of responded as a country, but what about individual volunteer managers? Because one of the big things when I talk to people is that they will say, oh well, I don't have anything to share, I don't have anything to offer, what could my contribution possibly be? And doing that sort of even on a small scale, and even sort of within the safety of sort of their own initial networks, can sometimes be a big deal. So if we're saying to people to do this on a global scale, what do you think about that?
I think everybody has got something that somebody else can learn from. Everybody knows something, has an insight into something that somebody else can learn from. And it's about having the confidence that somebody out there actually can really value our insights and our perspectives on things. And it's about having the kind of the front, for want of a better phrase, which I don't think we're good at because our kind of British Reserve kicks in, to actually kind of put ourselves up there and say something. And of course, the perspective, and it's almost the kind of implicit way in which I ask that question, you ask that question there, Sue, is that it kind of assumes it's an individual getting up in front of a room full of people from a different country and talking about their experience. And it could just simply be posting a comment to a discussion group in another country. So anybody who's a member of UK VPNs, there is an equivalent group in Australia, New Zealand called OzVPN. There is an equivalent group in the US called CyberVPN. Posting a response to the similar kinds of questions that get asked on those forums, but to give somebody a different insight from a UK perspective, giving as well as getting back. Or it could be subscribing to something like eVolunteerism, International Journal of Volunteering, reading articles from there, submitting, there's one piece that comes out in that every quarter, which is called Along the Web. So it's around a particular topic, and it's a list of websites related to that topic. Well, it may be that, on a particular topic, of a really good UK website, there's a really good resource on your website, which you could post onto that forum. It could be as simple as that, and just adding to that body of knowledge and expertise globally, because it's a collective thing. We are as strong in terms of our knowledge as what we all share. It's not about having a handful of consultants or trainers or leaders. None of the consultants or trainers and leaders that I know in the sector are all about making sure that they're the most knowledgeable and expert person in the room. It's about gathering all of that knowledge and expertise together between all of us and making sure that we all benefit from it.
Yeah, I completely agree with what you're saying, and I think we are seeing a slight sort of shift with that, and I think it's kind of part of traditional challenges around the way that learning in particular has been sort of kind of something that's done to you rather than something that you kind of help to develop and deliver yourself. And I think, it's part of a wider shift with that. But I think we can really apply it to volunteer management because it is such a niche field. We've got even more opportunity to sort of share with one another and more reason to do it, really. I think.
Absolutely.
So I think people need to sort of get over this idea that they don't perhaps have something to share, because you're right, together we can make a massive contribution and learn from one another. And something like eVolunteerism Journal is a really great example. I noticed that, they've come up with this whole list of topics that they want writers for example. So there's opportunity there for people to sort of maybe have a go at something new and contribute in that way.
Yeah.
Sorry, go on.
I think the other thing I was just going to say, because it popped into my head while you were talking then, was, if people haven't seen it, a great example of international exchange around good practice in volunteer management is the How to Turn Your Organisation into a Volunteer Magnet ebook,
Absolutely.
which, completely free, and myself, Andy Fryer, Fraser Dyer put that together, but it was getting volunteer managers to write 500-word maximum essays on their perspectives around recruitment and retention of volunteers. And everybody who contributed to that pretty much was a hands-on, frontline practitioner of volunteer leadership and engagement, and had loads of insights from the importance of, having plenty of food available through to maybe slightly more academic approaches, but all of which were about building the knowledge. And something like that we could easily do again. In fact, there are some conversations beginning to take place between Andy and myself and a chap called Tony Goodrow from Canada about a workshop that we might be running together in Washington DC in the States next year for the big American conference on volunteering, which, if it comes off, one of the things we'll be asking people for from our 3 respective countries, Canada, Australia and the UK, is for examples of really great innovative practice around engaging volunteers, because we can then share those with colleagues from around the world.
And I think people need to sort of realise that what they're doing is innovative, and is, they don't always recognise it. I mean, the stories that I hear people tell me on training about, things that they've overcome and ideas, creative stuff that they're doing with volunteers, because they're just sort of doing it and getting on with it and making stuff happen. It's all part of this wider idea of acknowledging and celebrating what we do. So
Absolutely.
There's some excellent suggestions and examples there, Rob, and let's hope people are kind of getting a bit excited about the sort of things that they could potentially get involved in. But one more question for you as part of this section, and that was one of your questions from your blog, was you were sort of saying to volunteer managers, what is it that you want to learn about from other countries? What sort of things would you like to find out about? So to throw that back to you and say, what do you think's out there for people that perhaps that we haven't yet mentioned? Is there anything else?
I think, for me, one of the really the really inspiring things about seeing and learning about volunteering in other countries is the way in which those societies, certainly the ones that I've experienced, are far more willing to acknowledge day in, day out the contribution that volunteers make, and how that can help volunteer management, and how that can help us kind of promote what we do and gain support, ultimately not just for ourselves but for volunteers and the contribution that they make. I think people who've heard me speak since the summer will have heard me say that one of the things that I think the Olympics did is it's kind of lifted the veil for a lot of the public on actually the massive contribution that volunteers make to society in this country, because we're not good at celebrating and publicly recognising it. And I think there's a lot that we can learn about from there. And the other one would be technology and the way that technology is being used in other countries. We talk about something like this webinar is brilliant because of the challenges of bringing people together across the huge distances that are involved in the UK. Well, take that and translate that into Australia, and the huge distances that we're dealing with are nothing.
Exactly. Yeah.
And therefore the way that those technologies are being used to network and engage with volunteer managers and also to facilitate more volunteering, I think there's some fantastic potential for us to learn.
I think so too. I'd love to get more kind of international sort of stuff happening through the webinars, but we'll get there. And finally, Rob, I'd just sort of like to ask you sort of what you would say to someone who's quite new to all this, because we do get a whole kind of range of people joining in with the webinars, and so say someone's just joining this webinar for the first time today, and it's one of the first things that they've done in their roles as a manager of volunteers. They're just starting to maybe connect, or maybe they've seen a bit of the Twitter feed, and is this something that they can contribute to at this stage, or do you think that's something that people should work up to in their role as a volunteer manager? It's almost kind of like, you sort of connect locally first and then you go globally, or does it just get stuck in there right from the outset? What would your advice be?
I would get stuck in there right from the outset, because I think if you're new to a volunteer management role and it's not an area that you've got a lot of expertise, first of all, well done for joining this webinar, because it's one of the best ways to connect people in this country and learn. But I would, it means that you're open-minded to all kinds of different influences and opportunities to learn in a way that those of us who've been around in the sector for maybe 20 years might not be so much. And I think, when very quickly sometimes people get to the perspective of either thinking they know it all or thinking that everything that needs to be known about volunteering can be found within the borders of the United Kingdom. Yeah. And, to really try and embrace that earlier on gives you a much broader and richer knowledge and understanding of volunteering. But it is about pacing. I mean, it's not you go international and you don't go local. It's about, the two aren't mutually exclusive.
No, of course not.
But it's about pacing, and it's about finding the right places to go. So I would definitely start with something like the Magnet ebook, something like the OzVPM or Cyber VPN discussion group, something like e-volunteerism, or going and having a look at something like the Energize website in the States and looking at all the various different international resources that are available there, and just picking the things that probably are likely you think are going to give you the most value in the short term, as well as talking to those of us who've been around for a while and could maybe point you in the direction of some of those resources.
Yeah. Excellent. Brilliant, Rob. Thank you very much indeed. And just to say to everybody that a lot of the resources and things that Rob's talking about here, I'm going to share a couple of them with you later, and I know that Chris is tweeting out and sharing some links and things. So I think if you check out the IVM Day hashtag, then hopefully they'll all be labelled with that. And we'll also send out some follow-on resources after the session as well, so that, to make sure that everybody's got access to those. Because I think, Rob, your point that you made at the very beginning is really valid, actually. It's often that starting point is often the hardest part, really, isn't it? Finding the way in.
Absolutely.
So I'm just hoping and wondering whether any of our participants today would like to come on the line and chat to Rob, whether you've got a question from me or for Rob, or just a comment or just an example of something that you've done to connect with people in different part of the world. I've just been sort of finding out from Chris whether we've got anybody. We've got some people who are sort of half unsure as to whether or not they'd like to join us. It's really not that scary. It'd be great if we got anybody with their hand up. No? I thought that was Karen Jones with her hand up then for a minute. Is it not? No?
No, she's waiting until she gets me face to face on Friday.
Yeah. No, some people need to be in a badger costume apparently before they'll put their hand up and speak on the webinar. So that, we should have known that we could have issued those beforehand. Well, maybe people will join us a little bit later on because we have got some more content to get through. We've not got. I think there's been a lot of links flying around with some of the discussion, so that in itself is really, really excellent and helpful. Well, we've got a poll for you to participate in. There we go. We like those. Thank you ever so much, Rob. Hopefully we'll come back to you in a little while because I'm interested for you to comment on some of the other content that we've got as well. So having listened to Rob there, everyone, and having a chance to think about some of this stuff, what is it that you think we can learn from looking outside of the UK? And there's probably more options to choose from here, but we've just come up with a few. Is it that you feel you can gain ideas, opportunities and inspiration to support both yourselves and your organisations? Is it just simply that sharing those differences and similarities can be quite reassuring? Or is it that you're still not quite convinced, you're kind of thinking, yeah, it's useful, but I feel like there's enough going on here. Oh my gosh, we've got 100% going for A. Some people are booking the trend, that's fine. No one's saying it's more of a distraction than a help, which is excellent. So I'll just give you a moment to respond to that. There's quite a few of you still left to vote there, so if you want to just come back from putting the kettle on, come and vote in the poll. That would be good. Yeah. We've got most of you in there. So 92% of you are saying that we can gain ideas, opportunities and inspiration. So a lot of buy-in to this idea. I suppose the next part of, for a little while, it's about sort of thinking about how can we convert this enthusiasm into some positive action to make sure that we follow up on it. I think that's the most important thing. Okay. So thank you, Rob. I think it's time to hear from our next contributor. It's one of the things that I wanted to do in the presentation is to share with you some of the interesting things that are going on in other parts of the world, and Rob has alluded to some of them. But I wanted to share a very specific example of something that I've been really, really interested in following the development of just recently, and particularly where I've got my sort of training and learning head on. So on the screen there you've got the information for Claire Teal, who is Programme Manager at Volunteer New Zealand. She's also Deputy Chair of Volunteer Wellington. And Claire's contact details are on the screen there as well. It's really worth checking out Volunteer New Zealand's website and signing up for their newsletter. I think Rob mentioned it earlier, because they got a great kind of communications thing, the way that stuff comes through to you, and they're really pinpointing a lot of the international stuff that's going on as well as what is actually happening in New Zealand. Claire and I have been chatting a fair bit via Skype and Twitter and email over the last 12 months. Which has been very interesting, but also brilliant fun, which is excellent. So I've kind of connected with somebody there that I've never met, but I feel like I really know them, which is, it's one of those kind of great things about using technology. I have to say I've been quite inspired by the work that Claire's been leading on in New Zealand, and in particular the depth of consultation that's taken place with volunteer managers and their whole approach to finding out what it is volunteer managers actually want and need. And the project focuses on supporting managers and volunteers around their professional development within their roles. Now, it's actually the middle of the night right now in New Zealand, so unfortunately Claire's not able to join us live. I know that they did a webinar themselves earlier today, all about sort of their work. So they've had their own broadcast, which you can actually kind of listen to a playback of if you check out their website. But she's actually kindly recorded a short piece for us for this particular presentation, and what it does is it just provides an overview of her project, and I'm hoping you're going to find it quite interesting.
Hello, I'm Claire Teal. I'm the Program Manager at Volunteering New Zealand. I'm recording this message to you on a beautiful pre-summer afternoon in Wellington, New Zealand. Happy International Volunteer Managers Day to you all from all corners of the world that you're tuning into this webinar today from. I am just here today to, I guess, add New Zealand's little part of the picture to what's going on in the world for managers and volunteers. Here in New Zealand we've been pretty busy working away over the last couple of years in some development work, both for individual managers and volunteers and for the organisations that they work within as well. And so to give you the nutshell version of what we've been doing, all of this work started back in 2009 when there was a national volunteering conference in Wellington, and there was a real sense at that conference from managers and volunteers that they were feeling really sick of not being recognised for what they do and wanting more development options for themselves, just really wanting something to happen basically. So as a result of that conference, a group of us got together and formed what would become a national working group to look at the things that we were being asked for by managers and volunteers at that conference. At the same time, there was some really fantastic research being undertaken by Dr. Karen Smith and Dr. Carolyn Cordery at Victoria University here in Wellington. It's called Managers Matter, Who Manages New Zealand's Volunteers. And it was a survey of over 800 managers and volunteers from across New Zealand, a huge diversity of organisations and walks of life. And it really cut to the core of who are New Zealand's managers and volunteers, what do they do, what would they want to do, how do they feel about their role. So we had a huge amount of information coming at us at once about the lie of the land for managers and volunteers here. It turned out that there were really two key streams of work that could come out of all of that information, two really key things that managers and volunteers wanted. There was individual development for them as practitioners, as managers and volunteers. when we first started talking to people about that, they said, well, we want a qualification. There's no qualification for managers of volunteers. We need one. And we started asking questions around, well, what is it about the qualification that you want? What is it that draws you to that? And people's answers to that question tended to be things along the line of, well, it would give us recognition through status. It would give us a clear entry point to the profession. It would give us direction. We'd know that if we did this, then we could do that next, and that leads to whatever next down the road. So it gives us a pathway. And it was that key word, pathway, that we clapped onto. We formed a national working group made up of a great group of people from across New Zealand, and we started working on that pathway. If we're going to have a pathway, it means we've got to have something to mark movement. The thing we've used to mark movement are competencies for managers of volunteers. What is it that we do? What do we need to know how to do our role? Obviously, trying to ascribe tasks to that is like saying how long is a piece of string. There are so many things that we do. So we're developing 4 really broad competency areas and saying, this is a continuum. This is showing you where you are, where you'd like to be, where you'd like to develop. It's giving us that ability to move, that ability to have direction, and we're hoping to launch those in around February next year, and bring alongside that on the Volunteering New Zealand website a self-assessment tool and an information hub so that you can read the competencies, self-assess yourself against them, and then find out where you can go to do the extra learning and development that you require.
That's the end of our first clip from Claire. We've got more from her in a moment. I thought it'd be useful to just pause her presentation there briefly and just to consider some of the points that she's raised. Perhaps, for you to just think for a moment about what we can learn from their experiences in New Zealand. Because I think the concept of the learning pathway is quite interesting. And in some ways, versions of this suggestion are frequently raised by managers of volunteers here in the UK and indeed everywhere. And what I also think is interesting is the fact that, the need for a qualification to demonstrate recognition is almost the knee-jerk response everywhere. We initially think, oh, you need a qualification to show what we do and what we know. But I think what's interesting about this piece of work is that this isn't the approach they've actually chosen to take at this stage. It's almost as though the working group is sort of saying, actually, we need to take things back a step in order to lay some stronger foundations and to work with the organisations as well as individuals before progressing on to that next stage. There's lots of kind of reasons why probably they've chosen to take that view, and I'm not saying that model would to replicate itself here in the UK, but I just think the way that they've taken that approach, I think there's a lot maybe for us to sort of learn from and to find out more about. One of the things I thought would be interesting to share with you as well is just an example from the competency framework and pathway that Claire talks about. This is an example of how the competency of leadership within organisations is presented in the document that she was referring to. So obviously we don't have a tremendous amount of detail here, and a lot of this is still being trialled. But the idea of the learning pathway is something that volunteer managers can use for their own individual professional development. As Claire explained, a pathway suggests movement, and to show movement you need something to act as a marker or baseline. And this is where the competencies come from. As I understand it, these are quite high level. They're very broad, because if you read the detail there in the first column, this is not task-focused stuff. This is the bigger thinking stuff, which is another thing that I find quite interesting. And, they map out just 4 key areas. So there's going to be a lot of sort of detail kind of underneath each of those headings. Anyway, it's just, I hope, it's just a little taste of some of the stuff that they're going on with. And, I wouldn't want to talk about the project on behalf of Claire. It would be great if we could have had her on live. And you can find out more about it. We've got a little bit more to hear from with Claire as well. And in this next section, she's talking about the organisational development side of things.
Now, we can have the most developed onto it progressive managers of volunteers in the world. if our organisations don't realise why they involve volunteers or why they might need a manager of volunteers or what that person does, are we really any further forward? So to that end, we formed another working group, and this one looks specifically at volunteer involving organisations. Now what we've done along that line of work, we're actually launching on International Volunteer Managers Day, 5th of November, hooray, best practice guidelines for organisations. Now these aren't sort of a guide to how to manage volunteers well. This isn't sort of, what you need to do to be a good manager. This is looking at the whole organisation. How does that organisation strive to learn about why it involves volunteers, learn about what those volunteers do, learn about how critical the involvement of volunteers actually is to achieving any of the mission that that organisation sets out to achieve? What does the manager of volunteers do? How can they be involved at a more strategic level in the organisation to make sure that everyone is getting the best out of the engagement of volunteers, including the volunteers themselves? So again, we've gone really broad, 4 broad category areas. Really inspirational stuff. We're not wanting to create a standard that you're passing or failing. We're wanting to create a document that you can go back to year in, year out, evaluate your progress against, see the successes that you've made, challenge yourself for the future. We piloted the guidelines with 30 really diverse organisations across New Zealand, and feedback that we got, we made lots of changes after the first round of feedback, but the feedback that we got was really revolutionary stuff. People having their job descriptions reviewed for the first time ever. A board member being delegated the responsibility for connecting with the volunteer section of the organisation, just realisation that volunteers exist and why they're there. So we've got exciting plans for those guidelines. We've formed a group of champion organisations from within that pilot group who are really going to work alongside us and be the peer encouragers throughout the first year of the guidelines' existence to really make them real, I guess, show examples of inspiring practice, the failures and the successes within their organisation as they work through the guidelines. So, in a nutshell, that's what we've been doing here in New Zealand. You can find out more at Volunteering New Zealand's website, which is just www.volunteeringnz.org.nz. I guess the most important things to say are that this work came from the people, from the managers of volunteers around New Zealand, and we've always done our best to take it back to the people, be that through subsequent conferences, regional workshops around the country, constant seeking of feedback. And so at the end of the day, I think we're coming up with some solutions to problems that are actually devised by managers of volunteers themselves. And so great to be able to share that with you today. Sorry I can't do it in person. It's kind of, the middle of the night here in New Zealand as you're all meeting and talking. But please do contact me through Volunteering New Zealand's website if you'd like to talk any more about it. Happy Managers of Volunteers Day again, and hopefully catch up with some of you soon. Okay, bye!
I really want to say thank you, Claire, but I know she can't hear me, but I will thank her. So we tried to highlight some of the key points in Claire's piece there on the slides, so we hope that that was useful. I was just trying to pull through some of the key points, and I know without seeing, the completed piece of work, it's difficult to get a full understanding on it. But I think what's interesting about this is that I think you get a real sense of them having taken the time to consult and pilot the activities involved, and I think this is a really significant and a lot of value. And I also think that the twofold approach for individuals and for organisations, yet with a very clear link, is really crucial. And I know, this is the area where volunteer managers often feel that they don't have that link back with the organisation. So let's hope that this work, is allowed to continue, and I'm sure it will reap rewards. It feels like a very organic piece of work, so it will be really interesting to see how it develops. So I know we've had a few really interesting comments coming through about how people have benefited from international exchange, and I want to come back to that in a moment. But just while we've been listening to Claire's piece there, I just wondered whether anybody would like to comment or come on and sort of share any thoughts about, what we can learn from the approach that they're taking there. I'm going to ask Chris if anybody wants to talk to me Nobody wants to talk to me today. If you do want to talk to me, you just have to press the little hand icon on your screen, or you can send Chris a little message there. Okay, what about Rob then? Rob, I wonder, I'm sure you've got something to say about all this. Rob, I'd love to bring you back in if you're still there. Hi, Rob.
I'm still here, yeah.
Hey.
I've always got something to say.
I know. I'm counting on it. So I know that you've obviously featured Claire's project on your, she's on one of your featured blogs earlier in the summer.
Yeah.
And you connect with Claire quite a lot anyway. And so, any thoughts about, if we're taking this perspective of what we can learn from what's been happening over there, have you got any kind of key thoughts that you'd like to share?
Yeah, and I mean, I'd start by saying I think VNZ are probably doing some of the most interesting and innovative work around volunteer management anywhere in the world at the moment. I think they're really, other than in Warrington, I think they're absolutely leading the way on this completely. And it's going to be really interesting to see what the work that they're doing out there, what impact that actually has on volunteer management. I'd start, I think, with one of the observations you made, Sue, about qualifications. And certainly here we do seem completely wedded to the idea that, if we've got, I think it ties back to this idea of we've got all this anxiety about are we a profession or not. And we seem to have bought into this belief that in order to become a profession we have to have some kind of objective standard qualification. And yet the qualifications and the qualifications frameworks that we have, and it's my opinion only, I don't think actually make people generally better volunteer managers. I was looking before today at going back to the National Occupational Standards. And when you look at the National Occupational Standards...
Because you always read them over breakfast, don't you, Rob?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I couldn't help but jump in with that.
Breakfast or when I'm struggling to get to sleep at night.
I'm sorry, go on.
And you look under manage and develop volunteers. So this is about how do we develop people? How do we really get the maximum potential out of people who are really committed to what they want to do with our organisation? And it's plan, organise and monitor, maintain records, manage expenses. It's just, it would put you to sleep. It's process. It's not about dealing with people. It's not about leadership. It's not, it's about management. And so I think what's been really interesting with what they've done is they've actually gone back to volunteer managers and they've gone back to organisations in New Zealand and they've said, look, what really makes somebody good at this? What really makes somebody competent at this? And they found a way of getting volunteer managers, and I may be casting aspersions on our colleagues in New Zealand because I've not been there, so I don't know if this is true, but it has been true of this country in the past. They've actually got managers to lift their heads above the desk and actually contribute to something bigger than themselves. Yeah. And I think the stuff you guys have been doing through these webinars and what have you started to build that culture in the UK, but for a very, very long time, trying to get anybody to do anything other than their day job was an absolute nightmare. So they've not been wedded to qualifications. They've got people looking broader than just kind of what they do and broader than just a kind of really structured qualifications framework. And then I think the fact that they focus their best practice guidelines on what kind of culture and attitudes need to be in place in an organisation in order for volunteering to thrive is absolutely spot on. Because it's the complete opposite, in my mind, of something like investing in volunteers, which is, have we got the right processes and systems and policies in place?
Yeah.
And the competencies framework is simpler and it cuts more to the heart of what good volunteer management is than whether or not we've got some kind of objective standards that you can evidence whether you can hit or not, because it's actually about, are you competent at this? Can you do it? Not can you fill in an expense claim form for a volunteer properly?
I Excellent. No, I think you said that brilliantly. I absolutely agree with everything, and that's exactly what I see when I read about it, and the comparisons that you make with other sort of systems and structures that we seem to have created. Having seen those develop and actually having been part of some of those working groups over the years, there's been an element of frustration in with that, and I think it kind of goes back to what you were saying earlier about, thinking more broadly, looking beyond our sort of day-to-day. We are so very bogged down in the day-to-day, and a lot of it is fed by, at first when you see the term best practice guidelines, there's an interpretation there about what you might expect, but I think the way that it's described and the way that it's set out, it's really not like any other kind of best practice guidelines I've come across before when it comes to working with volunteers, and that's what's kind of so interesting about it. Speaking about getting people to sort of stick their necks out and above the parapet, Rob, Chris and I are desperately trying to get some people to talk to us on this webinar, and well, there's quite a lot of chat going on, which is brilliant, so well done everybody for that. It is a little bit of a shame that nobody wants to come and join us, but we don't mind. It's just, we just worry that it's just us talking all the time. Not that people don't want to hear from you, Rob, because obviously they clearly do. There are a couple of comments coming in that sort of take us back to our earlier discussion that I thought would be really nice to share. And it'd be interesting from everybody if you have any comment on, the stuff from Claire's presentation or what Rob's had to say about it. If you want to if you don't want to come speak to us, if you just want to type that up or share it on Twitter, that would be brilliant. But I know there were a couple of comments that I thought looked like they were worth sharing. There was one from Simon and one from Tina earlier on. So Simon was saying that he'd linked in really well with Rob and Jane Cravens over a piece of work that he was doing here in the UK, looking at customer service in volunteer management. Yeah. I remember this particular piece of work. This is Simon Hancock's over at Community Action Derby. And I think Simon was looking for research sort of immediately within the UK and sort of needed to look more broadly. And I know that Jane gave some American stats and perspective, and that you, Rob, helped to link Simon up to some national statistics. So it gave, what he's saying there is the impact of that gave his piece of work and his report a lot more weight. So, and he is actually saying in his comment that he would have been happy to come on the line, but he's got no microphone. So we forgive him. We'd have loved to have had you on here, Simon. So yeah, I think that is just one example of where it's just a case of a quick email, a tweet, or a message on Ivor where you're sort of saying, does anybody have any further information about this? And it's almost kind of like if you ask, people are out there and they do want to help and support you. The other comment is from Tina Shelton, who's based with Special Constabulary in Greater Manchester, and she's saying that she's had some contact recently with the volunteer law enforcement officers in Florida, for the right reasons, I hope, Tina, I'm sure. And we are arranging a Skype session to share some ideas and work out how we can work together at such a distance. Fantastic. So I think none of us are making enough use of Skype. I know I kind of dabble with it a little bit with the international people that I connect with, but I think we could do a lot more with it actually, just within the UK too. We've got John Ramsey on the line. John wants to talk to us. Excellent stuff. Hello, John. Can you hear me?
Hi, Sue. I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Oh, we can hear you beautifully. Hooray! Thank you for joining us. What would you like to say?
I was going to say we've talked a lot about personal accountability and personal responsibility for both our individual development, but also I think development about volunteer management. I was going to ask both you and Rob whether you think government has a role to play in that, and if so, what it is.
It's a brilliant question. I was expecting nothing less. Rob, I'm going to throw this one over to you initially. Did you hear John's question?
Yeah, and like most times John asks me a question, I'll start with the words, thanks, John. I do think government has a responsibility. I do think government has a responsibility to promote and champion volunteer management and to use the resources that it puts into volunteering wisely. I don't think it does that necessarily. I think when it comes to international exchange, I don't think governments have really ever thought properly about volunteer management domestically, let alone internationally. And certainly in terms of encouraging more European engagement, I don't think this government would be particularly enthusiastic about that at the moment. I think the slight hesitation I have whenever we talk about government in relation to volunteer management is there does seem to still be largely a perspective from individual volunteer managers, certainly from volunteer involving organisations and infrastructure bodies, that it is the responsibility of government to fund good and effective volunteer management. And I think they have a responsibility to support it, but not to such an extent that it absolves organisations from their own responsibilities to fund and support good volunteer management. And you look at the way that they work on fundraising, where they have a responsibility for overseeing what is effective fundraising practice, because they've got reserve rights in charity law to introduce statutory regulation for that, but they do not get involved in actually funding directly, the work that the fundraisers do. Organisations take that responsibility on themselves. So I think government have got a role, but my caution is that we perpetuate this belief that it's down to government to fund good volunteer management, not our own organisations to actually recognise that it's an important investment of their own resources, even in these cash-strapped times.
Thank you, Rob. John, would you like me to answer the question?
Go for it.
Well, I asked Rob to answer it first, so I could say yes, I agree with Rob. No, I think there's a lot in what Rob's saying that I do agree with, because I think there is a danger in kind of, if we sort of say it's up to government, then that becomes our kind of default position, and also it takes us back down that path of we're having something delivered to us, for us, and this is the kind of stuff where I think perhaps we've not always quite got that right in the past. And I think as we become more empowered and more knowledgeable and seeing the value in what people on the ground are doing, I do think the responsibility, I know it feels a lot like it comes back to us, but I am with Rob in terms of it needs to come from within the organisation. I think otherwise we're just becoming too reliant on expecting government to do it for us. I think they do have a role to play. I think they could be a lot better at how they speak and how they advocate and how they champion things, and how they include and acknowledge that volunteering needs to be resourced, it needs to be organised, there needs to be some element of leadership around it. However that happens, whether it's formal or informal. And I don't hear and see enough of that, and I think that is part of the problem. So it's more, for me, their role is more about messages and support, rather than delivering programs or setting up, funding to deliver programs, should I say. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yes, I think it does.
Okay, you're happy with that. Any other comment that you'd like to make, John, whilst you're on?
Actually, I only had another question, was do you think within the formal volunteering setting, volunteer management has become too institutionalised?
Too institutionalised? Can you just tell me a little bit more about what you mean? Because I think I know what you mean.
I think what I'm thinking about, that I think it goes back to Bob's point about we are too processy and not enough about people, and how difficult it is to break out of that, because we have become too institutionalised within the organisational management frameworks and structures. I guess that's where I'm going with it.
Yeah. No, I'd be inclined to sort of say, in a way, I think we have become a little bit bogged down and almost, dare I say, kind of victims, in that way, or we can perpetuate that sort of kind of role really, and I think there's a danger with that, definitely. I think it has all become about handbooks and toolkits and processes, and and this is actually, as a trainer, when I see people who are new, because I see a lot of people who are very new to this, a lot of people who've been just thrown into it, and they come and that's the stuff that they want to know about, because that's what they've been told that they need to learn about. We need to learn about how to do this on paper, and a lot of it comes from litigation or the threat of, and the misconceptions about, where volunteers sit within the wider law and all the rest of it. There's such, in a way, we've got all this information and all this knowledge, and yet in lots of ways when people come very new to this, they're kind of even less clued up than they were when I first started doing this stuff 8-9 years ago. So, I'm not sure if I'm answering the question or I'm going off down a whole other webinar theme here with this one. Rob, do you want to chip in?
Yeah, I would. Definitely. The short answer is yes.
It's a much better answer than mine.
The longer answer, because there is a longer answer, is not everywhere. You have to generalise massively when you answer a question like this. I think what's happened is I'm a big believer in a large part of why we find ourselves where we find ourselves, in thrall to processes and systems and procedures and all of that kind of stuff, is because of the way that as volunteer managers, certainly over the 18 years I've worked in the field, we have sought professional credibility as a profession, as professionals, and in order to do that we've adopted the trappings of the way that other people we perceive view themselves as professionals, and I think particularly in respect to human resources. And what used to be called personnel. For me, the striking thing is one of the volunteers that we heard from when I was at VE and we did the volunteer rights inquiry. And one of the volunteers, and this has stuck with me ever since, said the problem with volunteer management now is it's become about what volunteers can't do, not what volunteers can do. And I think that is the mindset that, for whatever reason, I think a lot of it is because of the way that we've wrongly, not that the seeking for professionalism is wrong, but the way we've gone about it perhaps is wrong, or could have been better. We've ended up in a situation where if you get a room full of volunteer managers together, they will talk about criminal record checks, reference checks, processes, application forms, health and safety. They will not talk about how do you deal with people. And how do you deal with individuals whose motivations change, and how do you lead and engage and inspire those kinds of people? Or if they do, it will be in a much smaller way than they talk about systems and processes. And I think that's how we become institutionalised. And I think that's something that at this point we really have to try and turn around and get the balance right, because it's not about not being institutionalised, it's about being institutionalised in the right way and in the right proportion. And we've got to find a way of turning that around.
Excellent. I think maybe this is where, we have to start to sort of take some of that opportunity, and maybe looking at what's happening elsewhere is a good way of kind of shaking it up a little bit for ourselves and saying, well, hang on, it doesn't have to be this way. Brilliant stuff. Thank you very much, John, for joining us. Appreciate it very much. We do have someone else who wants to join us on the line. It's very exciting. We've got Pamela. Hello, Pamela. Can you hear me?
Hello. Can you hear me?
Hey, we can hear you brilliantly.
Brilliant. This microphone's really old, so I'm glad it works.
It's working smashing. Excellent of you to join us. Do you have a comment or a question about National Occupational Standards?
Yeah, more a comment from, it follows on from what you've just been saying, and also from what Rob was saying earlier. I wrote a strategy for our organisation about 1.5 years ago before going on maternity leave, with the intention of keying it into the National Occupational Standards, which I'd learned in the Excellence for Volunteer Managing course. So when I came back, one of my first jobs was to read the National Occupational Standards and try and kind of key all of that in. And I found it an interesting read. A lot of the things that Rob's just been saying about process, it seemed like it had the most basic nuts and bolts that people could ever need if they were a complete novice and coming to it with no preconceptions or knowledge of anything, right up to the big picture of influencing up and making big strategic kind of developments and that kind of thing. It seemed a strange set of standards, and it's massive. And I just felt like maybe it would be better if it was at least 2 different sections, the sort of the nuts and bolts of here's what you need to do, and then the bigger strategic kind of, looking at that development side of things. It seemed a lot of different things lumped together in one kind of, do you know what I mean? Like really focusing in on the most minute structures that people, probably most of which would understand anyway, and a bit tick boxy. So in terms of my work and trying to kind of marry the 2 together, I did feel a bit like, well, there's a lot of these things, I'm pretty sure we do. I'm not going to sit and go through everyone and say, oh, well, we don't do that one, we best do that now. Because it wasn't right. It needs to be interpreted, and I think interpreting it for your organisation is another separate skill that isn't something you can assess in the National Occupational Standard. So I just kind of wanted to raise that issue. It's interesting what Rob said about process and things. No, I agree.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed, Pamela. And I think you put that really, really beautifully. I think your experience of actually using them is really valuable for people to hear about, because a lot of people know about this document or this tool or whatever you want to call it, and yes, our qualifications that sit on the national qualifications framework are based on it.
I can see that working. I mean, obviously I've done it as well, and I think if you're teaching someone what the different practical elements are of volunteer management, I think the standards do that. But if you're looking for guidance on how to grow your program and how to influence and how to make bigger changes, it doesn't support you to do that. And what Rob was saying about talking about, if you get people together, they'll talk about CRB and application forms and blah, 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 and they won't talk about what they do with people. I think it's very difficult to talk about what you do with people, because a lot of that's more a sort of emotional, intuitive thing. It's not really something you say, well, here are I follow this process with people of this type or whatever. It's quite difficult to pin that down and to talk about it.
Yeah, I think it's also part of a wider thing that's happening also, kind of, that I'm noticing within the weekly chat that we have, that sometimes people aren't as comfortable wanting to talk about that stuff because, we need to know that that's a safe space and all that kind of stuff. I really liked what you said about, just going back to what you said originally about, separating out the nuts and bolts from the kind of the other more problematic kind of stuff. And I think that's maybe indicative of, even though the NOS themselves, having been involved in a lot of this stuff, have been rewritten and redeveloped, things are really changing all the time, and they're changing quite quickly. And I think we've arrived at a place now where we're sort of saying, well, hang on a minute, we're being asked to do different things, we're being asked to think differently. Newer people are coming into the profession, and they're asking really good questions about, well, why are we doing it this way? What have we got this for? So it's kind of what I meant before when I said it's almost like a bit of a turning point, which is where we are. So I guess it's about, which way we help people to shape that. Rob, do you want to jump in at all and comment?
Yeah, just a couple of very quick things. I absolutely hear what both of you are saying, actually, about dealing with people issues being a lot more tricky and thorny, and people being more reluctant to talk about in some respects and process stuff. However, one of the most common things that I know kind of trainers in this field are asked to train on is dealing with problem volunteers, or more accurately, dealing with problem behaviour by volunteers, which I think is quite a good example, because what people want is they want simple A plus B plus C equals D answers.
They do.
Actually, it's about doing it, and some of the most powerful learning that I've seen go on in those kinds of sessions is where people open up and talk about dealing with individuals and the learning that they've had of dealing with particular individual situations, because somebody else will go, well, that's not exactly the same as how I was doing what I faced, but I can take the lesson from that and apply it back in, and that could apply just as much in the more positive elements of working with volunteers than just dealing with problem behaviour. I think the other two things, which was prompted by what you were saying about the National Occupational Standards, for me, I think the question we've got to be able to answer is what makes somebody a successful volunteer manager or an effective volunteer manager.
Yeah.
And whenever we posed that question previously on UK VPNs, people struggle to answer it. We struggle to answer what makes somebody effective. We can talk about the left brain stuff, the processes, but Wally Harbour, who writes sometimes for Third Sector and did a really good book on baby boomers and volunteers, talks about temperament and says, not everybody has the temperament to be a sailor or a bus driver, and not everybody can be a successful volunteer manager. And I suppose the thing that's really interesting for me about what makes people effective as volunteer managers is those less tangible, less objective things that make us successful, that make us effective, things like temperament and our ability to engage and inspire and lead others. And I don't quite think we've got enough focus on that, or had enough focus on that in the past, and I think that's maybe where we need to focus a bit more going forwards.
Thank you, Rob. Sorry, Pam, did you want to add something there?
Yeah, I was going to say, is that not something we can take lessons from other kinds of management? Because we've all had good and bad managers in jobs all the time, and it's surely the same skills, because it's about liaising with people and having empathy, but being able to be effective and make things happen. Obviously, the training, the level 3 training and things were done through the ILM. I don't know anything about the ILM other than having done my training under their umbrella. But perhaps is that not somewhere we could take lessons from? What do they do?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it goes back to the conversation we were having earlier on about inductive learning, about taking things from a different context, whether it's something from overseas or from a different management or leadership context and what have you, and applying it back in. The only note of caution I would add is that perspective we were talking about with John, that we've ended up where we've ended up because of trying to ape what other people do rather than trying to take the best of what other people do and apply it into something that we're confident enough has its own identity without trying to mirror what somebody else does.
I think what's really interesting is that your question, Rob, that you say about what makes for an effective volunteer manager, to me that's the question that New Zealand have asked with the work that they've done. That's what they've kept coming back to, because they've tried to really get under the skin of it. Now, I really don't know a lot of detail about the project, but it's just the little bit that I've read about it and from talking to Claire, that is the impression I get, that's the path that they've taken. They've really tried to understand what this stuff is about, and it's interesting because I'm conscious of time. It's funny, isn't it, when you put these things together, you always worry you've not got enough content, and here you are an hour and a half later, you've still got 24 people joining you. It's fantastic. Thank you for staying with us this long. Someone's asked a question about the difference between investing in volunteers and what they're doing, the best practice guidelines in New Zealand. To answer that question, I don't know enough about what they've actually produced. I think a lot of it's still being consulted on and developed and piloted, etc. Keep an eye on their website and contact Claire, because she'd happily talk to you about it if you want to know more detail. But I think at first look, it is this distinction between what you were saying before, Rob, about culture and approach, and how we think and feel about this stuff, if I dare say it in that way, versus the processes of, that kind of checkboxy sort of approach that you were referring to, Pam. And that for me is the biggest distinction at first look. Now, obviously, there's layers and different things within there that we need to unpack. But I think more on this maybe, or let's see what we can learn from elsewhere. Thank you, Pamela. Thank you for joining us. And we do have one more question that we can squeeze in, because I know Lisa has been waiting very patiently to come on. So I'm going to squeeze that in, and then I'm going to share some resources with you quickly, and we've got a couple of polls to finish up. Just to let you know what's going to happen next. So, Lisa, are you there?
Ah, yes, I am.
Hi, Lisa.
Hello, you're
Hi,
right.
Lisa.
Hello.
So, what was your question or your comment that you wanted to? Was it something about qualifications?
Well, it's about process and qualifications, really.
I see.
I'll start with process. I know we did a blog about it a couple of weeks ago about whether volunteer managers are kind of tied up in red tape. I have to say, I have to have an element of process within the work that I do because of the area that I work in. We have commissioned services where there is an expectation from the people buying those services that the volunteers that we involve in our services have been through a suitable selection process. So I do have to follow a certain amount of process. And I think for an organisation where I am the only person in England who is full-time volunteering in terms of the sort of, I come from a slightly strategic level now, but I am the only person where that is my entire job. I have hundreds of volunteer managers who, where volunteer management is part of a wider remit. In a way, they do need that process to be able to help them work their way through the sort of process of actually initially engaging a volunteer to sort of getting them up and running. So I think there has to be a nice balance between process and people, certainly. We try and make those processes flexible where we can so that we're not stifling volunteers. But I have to say I need process sometimes because of the organisation that I work in and the demands of our commissioners. When we do the training, people want to know about the process, but I do try and sort of feed into that the bits about the people as well. You know, that's really important, and I agree with Rob that the best learning scenarios come from people who have actually done it in real life, because you're never going to have a one-size-fits-all for everything. So I really try and encourage that type of learning, because, you know, as the volunteer manager day things, you have to be a coach, you have to be a leader, you have to be a lot of things when you're a volunteer manager, and that's very difficult to teach in a one-day introduction course to volunteer management. So I think a lot of the learning that happens it comes from people who are actually doing it either in this organisation or another. So I think there needs to be a nice balance around process and people, particularly where I'm working. And in terms of qualifications, again, I think there has to be a happy medium. I've worked with volunteers since 1998, so I have about 14 years of experience. But I've never had a qualification. But I have noticed in a lot of job advertisements now, organisations are expecting people to have qualifications of some nature in volunteer management. So I don't know whether there's some role for us to play around influencing the people who are recruiting people into these roles or not. I mean, I'm doing one at the moment, which I won bizarrely in a draw. Very strange.
I love that you won a volunteer management qualification in a draw.
Well, I won the course, put it that way.
Of course.
So I'm kind of working my way through that, and you know, I'm learning some things. A lot of things, you know, I'm already kind of working, you know, in my day job. But you know, I think I'm going to value having that, I think, you know, in terms of when you're sort of job hunting and things like that, because a lot of people are expecting you to have that. So I think it's a kind of happy medium on both of those. And I'll stop rambling now.
Not at all. You're not rambling at all. I think, you know, it's about what we all think, Lisa. I think it's not about abandoning the processes. It's about saying we need them to underpin what we do, but we shouldn't be hung up on them. And I think the danger is that we've got a little bit too hung up on them, and a lot of that, it's driven for lots of different reasons. So, as you say, you know, it's time to sort of look a little freshly at what we're doing, I think. I think we are starting to do that.
Yeah, I think Susan Ellis said something interesting when she was doing her webinar, is that, you know, don't assume that people know about volunteer management, because I think we can be very guilty of that, because we know, or we think we know, and so we assume everybody else is just going to be able to pick it up just like that. And I think sometimes people need that kind of step-by-step guide to work them through it sometimes, because I think a lot of people are quite frightened of it because of all the things you need to be, and because there's, you know, it's about people management when it boils down to it a lot of the time. It does frighten people, so you do need that kind of step-by-step guide sometimes, I think.
No, I think you're absolutely right. Thank you very much for joining us. I am conscious of time, so I'm going to kind of, thank you, Lisa, I am going to kind of bring this back to our global perspective, because I think what's really interesting about all the discussion that we've just been having there is that was fueled by listening to Claire's presentation and having a look at what's happening in New Zealand and look at where that's taken us, you know, just in this short space of time. So we could just start a whole kind of other webinar now looking at people and process. But I'm sensing that there's more to come on this. I'm sensing that we need to do a bit of exploration. Let's have some writing about this. Let's have a thoughtful Thursday about this at the very least. Let's start talking to one another about some of this. So fantastic that came out of looking at what is happening over the other side of the world, really. I wanted to just share with you some resources and some places to sort of go to, if you like, as a starting point, because going back to the beginning of the presentation, you know, when Rob was talking about, you know, often people find it difficult to find a way in, and Rob had mentioned some of these sort of places. So a couple of things that I sort of come across and have been using lately are some of the LinkedIn groups. There's quite a few LinkedIn groups for volunteer managers, and although we've got the likes of IVO and UK VPMs that, you know, are very tried and trusted, and I think, you know, we need to keep championing use of those because there's a great networks involved there. Looking at LinkedIn, there's a lot more kind of international presence. So just within the context of what we've been talking about here, if that's what you're looking to do, that's in a way a place where you are going to find other volunteer managers. There's a woman called Kathy Cahill who I would have liked to have tried to get her to join us actually on the webinar today, but I couldn't. But she's very active in sort of promoting a lot of discussion there. And she's part of the Alive network, and there's two groups on LinkedIn that you can look up called the Volunteer Management Best Practices Network and the Volunteer Management Group. And I am conscious of time, so I'm not going to do a big kind of internet tour of websites, but I do think it's really worth having a look at Susan Ellis's website, Energize. There's some fantastic resources on there. You know, you've got someone like Susan on there who's been doing this stuff for sort of 40 years. So you've got all that depth of knowledge, and then she brings in people from all over the world and new people into the role to write about, to share resources. There's training, there's books on there, there's all kinds of stuff happening. And then I think Rob also mentioned about Andy Fryer's work in Australia, AusVPM. I think I tweeted out the other day when we were having this chat that long before we had Thoughtful Thursday Twitter chat, there was the monthly hot topic from AusVPM. And there's a great archive there, and it's still going with, you know, quite sort of challenging thoughts and perspectives on working with volunteers. So if we're looking to look not only beyond geographically where we're placed, but maybe also beyond where we've kind of thought about things before when it comes to volunteer involvement, they are some good places to start with. A couple of polls just before we sort of finish up. I was going to sort of, well, we'll do this poll because I think we've kind of gone down a different track, but just to get an idea of how connected you guys already are and what you're already kind of making the most of. So to what extent are you already involved in networking globally? So are you regularly contributing to discussion groups and sort of linking in with things like overseas newsletters, that sort of stuff? Or has it been one of those things where you've signed up for things, maybe at a conference, you've heard someone speak, you've signed up for the newsletter, but it kind of pops into your inbox and you've never really done anything with it? You know, the connections are there for you to make potentially, but you've not really took that step. Or is it that you would like to get more involved, but you really don't know where to start? Maybe you just don't think this is for you. This is for more strategic volunteer managers or for people who are more, perhaps more experienced. Okay, so the results are coming in there. And it looks like it's a sort of a split really between, yeah, we've started to sort of take the steps for this, but we've not really followed it up. Well, hopefully today will give you a little bit of momentum and a reason to go and follow some of that stuff up. I know Chris has been sharing a lot of the resources that have been mentioned, and we're going to send out quite a few things in the follow-up as well. I'd like to get involved, but I'm not sure where to start. Well, there we are. The follow-up that we send will give you that opportunity to take that next step forward. I think the other thing that I just wanted to say, just kind of a bit of a shameless plug really for Thoughtful Thursday, is that in itself, our weekly sort of tweet chat for managers and volunteers, is so much more interesting, I think, when we get all the different sort of perspectives in. So it'd be really, really nice to, you know, have more of a, you know, a global perspective happening there as well. So if anybody is connected to anyone who is for overseas who wants to get involved in Thoughtful Thursday, and indeed people from within the UK as well. We're really interested to hear your ideas about what you'd like us to focus on for that tweet chat, and indeed if you'd like to write a blog. And if you're not sure about writing a blog, just give us the idea and I'll find someone to write the blog for you. Final chance then for you to get involved with some comment. If you've got any more questions, if there's anything that you'd like to reflect on, we know it's been a bit of a long one here this afternoon. Thank you for staying with us. We hope it's been useful for you. Chris, do we have anybody else left to come on the line? Any more comments to share? Okay, that's fine. There's some information on the screen there for you. If you're on Twitter, you can follow us at VM Movement. Our volunteer management champions are tweeting from that account regularly, including myself and Chris as well. So we're trying to kind of build a momentum there and share some volunteer management resources with you. The hashtag for Thoughtful Thursday is TTVolManagers. And the webinar playback and resources will be found via the VM Movement website. The address is there. But because you've signed up for the webinar, you will get an email from us with a link to that. So you can share that with your colleagues. If you follow me on Ivo, Subi Jones, you'll also always get notified of things like the webinars and the Thoughtful Thursday tweet chat blog as well. I hope that it's been useful for you today. I'd like us to sort of keep sharing really ways in which we've personally benefited from international working and networking, or ideas for what things we'd like to find out more about from other countries. So please do keep sharing that stuff. Let's find out what people are going to do next, Chris, shall we? Put the kettle on, maybe. I'm sending Chris to put the kettle on. Certainly after this. So our final poll, what are you going to do next? Are you going to take a look at some of the resources that we've been talking about? Are you going to connect with some overseas volunteer managers? Are you going to tell others about International Volunteer Managers Day? Or are you just going to do all of it because that's the kind of volunteer manager you are? Okay. So nearly all of you have voted there. Just a few more to join in. Yeah, it looks like some of you are going to take that initial step and just have a look at the resources mentioned and see where that takes you, which I think is excellent. Quite a number of you are going to do all of the above. I'm going to be coming checking up on you, by the way, just so you know. I can't really tell in the poll who's voted which way. It is completely anonymous, don't worry. And yes, I think just telling other people about International Volunteer Managers Day and connecting is just a step in the right direction. Let's keep on it. I think that's the message. Thank you so much for joining us today. We do want to wish you a happy International Volunteer Managers Day. Please stay connected with us. As we said before, playback of the webinar will be up sort of later in the week. And we'll also make sure we follow up with all the resources we promised. Thank you so much to Rob. I don't know whether he's turned his mic off or he's gone, but thank you, Rob, for joining us.
Pleasure.
Excellent. It's been brilliant to hear from you. Thank you for giving up your time to do this today. Thank you to all of you for tuning in, and to those of you that came on the line to chat with us. We will be back in 2013, so watch this space. Have a lovely rest of Happy Volunteer Managers Day.